Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't see a whole lot of you up here, but come on down close if you like. My name is Kerlee Eels. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. How many of you here came from the Seattle area today? I want to say there's most all of you, because you're part of our totem group, or the greater AAA concierge group. And we are on the Alaska Totem Cruise, and what you have the opportunity to see today is unique. It's not been presented before, and it probably won't be presented again. And so you're in for a wonderful hour here. Now you may wonder, the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, what is that? Southwest Seattle Historical Society covers West Seattle, White Center, the entire Duwamish Peninsula, and those of you who know your history know that our peninsula is where Seattle was born. We are the birthplace of Seattle. We tell that story all the time. We are headquartered at the birthplace of Seattle Log House Museum on Alki Beach. How many of you have been to Alki Beach? There you go. Well, please come back and see us. We are open Thursday through Sunday, noon to 4, and we are so grateful to be the beneficiary of the Alaska Totem Cruise. And I want to thank Holland America, I want to thank AAA, specifically Liz Day in the audience, who is a West Seattle native who really got this idea going for the whole cruise, which is, all of you are here in one way or another because of Liz. And to thank all of you for coming today and supporting the Historical Society through a portion of what you paid for the cruise. And the opportunity that we have today is unique because of not only a long-standing study of Alaska and the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, but also because of a personal friendship. I was really fortunate to be able to call on Dan Kerlee to come on this cruise, and then also to be a presenter on this cruise. We have been learning for the past day or so on board, and also in the weeks leading up to this cruise, about what is Alaska today. Well, for this next hour, what I want you to do is to take your mind back a little more than 100 years ago and put yourself in the frame of mind of what was Seattle learning about Alaska more than a century ago at Seattle's first World's Fair. We are so fortunate to be able to have today Dan Kerlee. Would you please give him a big round of applause? Dan, take it over.
Well, thank you all so very much. It's really nice to see you, and that you would take the time to come and hear a little bit about this. And as you can see, we're going to discuss the AYP, that was Seattle's first World's Fair. And we've got a great set of slides to go through here today. I hope you'll really enjoy them. A lot of these images are rarely seen, have not really been ever shown even in Seattle before. So here we can see a bit of an image from a card produced by the Butler Hotel. Now, the Butler Hotel was one of Seattle's luxury hotels in these days, and it was the place where a sourdough who'd made it big would come and stay in Seattle when he came back down south. And I don't know if we can see it down here, but this is the totem pole at the AYP, and these folks are examining not only it, but many artistic features from the Northwest coast. Well, we'll try it this way. We'll see if we can get everything in sync here. Okay, here's a view of the central part of the AYP, and this was taken from a tethered unmanned balloon on the ground, 1,500 feet up in the air. Now, it would be a year before there would be any manned flights in Seattle. So this was tricky. This was all done with ropes and cables and trying to maneuver the balloon remotely from the ground. It actually took them several days to get a picture like this. But if we can get whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen quite yet. Yeah, well, we will get okay, get the right button pushed here. You can see here, now this is on the University of Washington grounds. If you know the university a little bit, there's Denny Hall up here and Parrington Hall, but that's about all that was there in 1909. It was mostly forest land, and so this was a great place to develop a fair like this. And if we look around here among these main government buildings, here is a building for the Philippines. Here's a big building to represent Hawaii. Here in the government building, there are all kinds of displays from the Smithsonian Institution and the U.S. military and many, many things. A fisheries building. Over here, we can see the Washington State Building. This building is for manufacturing, this one's for agriculture, one for mines, for foreign exhibits. But if we look over here at this big building, that's the Alaska Building. And today, if you know that red square area of the university, that's approximately where this is. So, a little background on the fair. This is Seattle's greatest commercial and artistic cultural venue ever. And why do I make this outrageous claim? Well, for one thing, the length of this fair, this was 6 months long, but also this was a special time to have an event like this. There's no TV, there's no radio, movies are very limited, and people learned much of what they learned simply by reading or by hands-on experience. And people were artists at this time, creating their own crafts and arts in a way that maybe we don't have today. So it was on the University of Washington campus, as we've mentioned. It consisted of these government buildings, but also national buildings from a few other countries represented in different ways. There was a lot of things from the Pacific Rim that were represented by this fair. And just a lot to see. There were state and county buildings. There were big performance venues and also big outdoors performance area for music and dance. There were beautiful, beautiful gardens. That's one of the things that this fair was really noted for. The grounds were developed by the Olmsted brothers, who were the designers of New York's Central Park and many city parks around the country. The greatest landscape design firm in the country, one of the great ones in the world. They laid this all out, over 1 million plantings on the fairgrounds, just a great story in itself. There's statuary, there's a big fountain that we'll see several times, and beautiful vistas that were laid out to take advantage of that Seattle landscape. And there were great art displays, international art displays. The California building alone had 250 plein air paintings, and if you like that sort of art, it was just a tremendous display to see. There was a large permanent multi-floor art building with art from France and other places around the country. And there was other sorts of commerce on display from all over the world, from Italy, from France and Germany. There's statuary and garden carvings and so forth all over Seattle still today, from Japan and around the world. And there was world-class entertainment. This consisted of all sorts of things. There was a huge roller coaster, there were musical performers, there were famous national traveling shows, not just local. And there were great cycloramas. These were the IMAX of their time. These are huge paintings in the round with dioramas and lectures. And there were several of these on the grounds, 2 especially large ones. There were many national conventions. There were fraternities would have their national programs all here at the World's Fair in Seattle in 1909. And there were national athletic and also local athletic competitions, but the AAU had its national meet there in Seattle, and there were world records set and so forth. So this is a very interesting time. This fair took place in a world of fairs, and there were over 150 world-class fairs that took place in the years from 1851 to 1908, and we've represented a few of them here. Some very famous ones that you can see up there. Maybe you recognize some of these. But the AYP fit in the middle of all this. It was a moderate-sized fair, but it was a very lovely fair, and is very important to the Northwest. It represented the entire West Coast, and meant a lot to the city. There were actually several other large-scale, shorter fairs in the United States in the same year, and some other fairs around the world. So, a little bit by the numbers. Seattle's population in 1909 was 230,000. Seattle had been a fairly successful smaller town in the 1880s, as you may know. In 1893, along with everyone else, it suffered, but especially up in the Northwest, kind of isolated still, it suffered quite a setback in 1893. There was a Great Depression then. So when the gold rush came along in 1898, Seattle's jumped on the bandwagon. They took the lead in promoting Seattle as the gateway to the Alaskan gold rush, which of course was taking place in Canada at the onset. But that is where Seattle really boomed, and it went from something like 30,000 residents to 230,000 residents in just 10 years. So the fairgrounds covered 200 acres. There were 45 buildings. These are large buildings, and dozens of smaller ones of the type we've mentioned. It lasted 4.5 months, but it really was attracting people a year before the fair started up. And people were touring the grounds, and many of the buildings were used for years after the fair, some even into the 1950s. The attendance of approximately 4 million people was just a great thing for a city of that size and that time. They came from all over, certainly all over the country, all over the world. It cost the equivalent of $40 million in today's money, and this was partly paid for by the U.S. government, partly by the state government, but also a great portion of this was raised by local subscription from the citizens. And it was 4 years from conception to creation, really quite an accomplishment there in 1909. And the number of objects that were shown, they can barely be calculated. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of things to be seen. Train after train of railroad cars bringing the materials onto the university campus. And there may be millions of objects, I don't know how we know. So now we're going to just take a quick little view of what it was like to sort of sit in the middle of all this. And you can see we'll pan across some of the display buildings. There's the main government. That's what's now Drumheller Fountain on the UW campus. And just take a quick little view around there from being at the heart of these great buildings. Now, World's Fairs have given us a great legacy, and there's a lot of iconic World's Fair stuff from this period. And of course, this is one of the best known things. It needs no explanation, I'm sure. The Eiffel Tower, in case anyone wants it. But here's some other great things that you might not have associated necessarily with World's Fairs. The 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia featured the head of the Statue of Liberty. This is the actual head of the actual Statue of Liberty. It was going around the country to try to raise money for the United States portion of this. Of course, this was a gift from France, but the U.S. had to create the base. And so here it is at the World's Fair in Philadelphia. And of course, in the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, one of the really great World's Fairs of all time, the Ferris wheel was invented for that World's Fair. So here's another iconic thing from one of our American World's Fairs. Is a sadder one. This is the Temple of Music where President McKinley was assassinated, and this led to, by an anarchist, and this led to President Roosevelt taking over as president, and of course that had a great deal of impact on world histories. And of course the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Perhaps many of you know this movie centered kind of around that fair. There's a number of legacy items from this World's Fair. Introduction of hot dogs, introduction of ice cream cones, and some things like this. But the thing that's really important for our discussion today about the St. Louis World's Fair is that it's sort of the grandparent of the AYP. It was probably the largest World's Fair ever, and means a lot to us. And here we get to a little bit of our own local, Seattle anyway, World's Fair iconography or legacy. For anyone who flew in to take the trip, yes, there really is a mountain here in Seattle. This is the way it looks from the UW campus today. And this vista was created by the Olmsted brothers for the fair. And here's another little bit of local legacy. The Dixieland band, the venue was one of the big attractions at the AYP, one of the great bands. This was an African-American orchestra and singers band in 1909. They showed early ragtime music, sort of almost early pre-jazz, shows about Southern life, all African-American. But these two people that kind of stand out on the left were some dancers, and they came to the AYP with the show. They were probably from the southeast, kind of via Chicago. They came to the AYP, and they are Jimi Hendrix's grandparents. If you know about Jimi Hendrix, his grandparents stayed in the Northwest, and Jimi was born in Seattle, and that's a little bit of fair history for us. Here's another very interesting little story and legacy from the AYP. This is actually a Russian cruiser that was sunk by the Japanese in a Great War in 1904 and 1905. It was resurrected from the bottom of the bay by the Japanese. They used it for their officer training cadets, and it would tour around the world every summer. In the summer of 1909, it came to the West Coast. It made an official visit to the AYP, and the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy had a contingent. They met up together. This was a very goodwill sort of a meeting. But one of the interesting things that was recorded by the newspaper while all the handshaking and so forth, the gift exchanging was taking place, the Hawaiian building had a large plaster relief model of this new naval base being planned on the island of Oahu. And the newspapers noted that all these Japanese cadets were scrupulously taking notes about this new proposed naval base. And one of these cadets, believe it or not, was Isoroku Yamamoto. He was a cadet at the time in 1941. He was an admiral, and he is the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So a very interesting little World's Fair tidbit associated with the AYP. But of course, Yamamoto was a great admirer of the United States. He didn't think, at least militarily, this was the greatest idea, and we all know the result of that. A couple of other legacy items that you might not have associated with the AYP if you know Seattle. William Henry Seward was the man who was responsible for purchasing Alaska from Russia and bringing it into the United States. His statue was unveiled at the AYP, actually partly at the behest of New Yorkers, because he came from New York. We don't show it here, but New York had a grand reconstruction of his home that they built at the AYP. This statue is now up in Volunteer Park in front of the lovely conservatory there. And another bit of AYP legacy that you might not have realized, a well-known building in Seattle, the Space Needle, of course. But the 1962 fair was originally conceived as the 50th anniversary of the AYP. And people who had helped put on the AYP, there was at least one prominent man left in 1959. And it had to be delayed by a couple of years, but the AYP definitely helped push the '62 fair into being and the creation of the Space Needle. Now, many of us here are on the Totem Cruise, and it's a wonderful thing. I just thought I'd show you that these things were going on during this period also. Here on the left, we see a 1906 Totem Cruise brochure, and if you peered inside this brochure, you'd see photographs of famous totem poles that this cruise would actually take you to from Seattle. And I've included something on the right that shows the cruise ship going to Glacier Bay in 1907. So we're part of a really great legacy here going on this cruise. And you can see how many, for how many years, how Seattle has sort of connected itself both commercially but also with the travel industry up to Alaska. But in 1909, things were a little bit different. Here is how you would land ashore in 1909 when you went to some of the locations in Alaska. This is an actual postcard that was created for the AYP. It was one of many, many different designs of postcards that would be handed out at the fair or purchased by visitors to the fair to coin them. You would, in 1909, you'd get off your nice steamer into a barge and stand up and be hauled by cable to the shore, and then you'd hop off onto the beach. And that was, we're going to do better than that, of course. And for everyone who's here to see Duke and Bill and learn a little bit about cooking, cooking was not neglected at the AYP. Here we have a souvenir cookbook. If you're going to the dinner with Duke and Bill, here is a special dinner menu from a formal event at the AYP. The AYP, of course, was for everyone, but there was a formal social side to it. Here is a special dinner given for President Taft by the governor of Washington. And I don't know if you could read it out there, but there's caviar on toast and oysters from Nakata and green turtle soup, salmon and mushrooms and roast mallard duck and reindeer salad, and all sorts of wonderful things. A very formal invitation-only banquet. The fair was promoted very heavily, and certainly the totems were part of the theme. Collier's was a national magazine that was well distributed and helped attract people to the fair. Here's another big magazine at the time, Judge Magazine, and you can see that this gentleman is trying to figure out how to route himself with all of his train tickets across the country. People arrived primarily by train and so forth. He's on his way. But I really like this magazine cover from Argus Magazine. Argus Magazine's a local magazine in Seattle, and here they're advertising the fair by making up the outline of Alaska out of these three ladies, and we'll see more of this three ladies idea in some of our pictures as they come along. But I want to show you this one. Here's, if you're familiar with Sunset Magazine, it's a Western magazine if you're not from our area. Sunset Magazine's still under publication. And here's the May issue of Sunset Magazine with the Exposition logo on the cover. But just for us, Sunset Magazine put an article in for, this is the current issue on the newsstands, the October issue of Sunset Magazine. And here's an article about how one part of the AYP Vista has just been reconstituted down on the lower UW campus. So the AYP is featured as part of the Best of the West right here this month in Sunset. But why still would Seattle have a World's Fair, way up in the northwest corner? Well, the state of Washington did have a long history of being involved in all those other World's Fairs that we looked at on a previous slide. And here's a couple of their buildings that kind of show the way that they were associated with the fair. On the left, you can see the Washington State Building from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And you can see how it's kind of a kind of vernacular architecture, very interesting. There's a lot of exposed lumber on the outside, and that was kind of the point of that building. Maybe even more interesting is this one on the right from the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. I like to call this the first Space Needle. Once again, you can see how it was specially designed to show off all that timber that you could get from Washington. But here is the Washington State Building at the Lewis and Clark Centennial Fair the year after the St. Louis Fair. You can see it's got a very different look to it. You might recall how those buildings looked at the center of the AYP in one of our first slides. If we think about this architecture a little bit for a moment, it's very traditional architecture. It's nothing like those playful buildings we saw a moment ago. It's a classical architecture. Sometimes this is called the Beaux-Arts style, after the great school in Paris, France. But buildings of this style were the central buildings of the fair, the more dignified heart of the fair. And so this is a big step up for the state of Washington. And after this fair in 1905, this would be more the type of building that Washington would use to present itself. So this was a real advance. But of course, this 1905 fair is very important to our story. This is the mother fair of the AYP, if you will. It was at this fair that a Seattle man who had a lot of Alaskan interests formed the idea of the AYP. And if we turn now to looking at how Alaska was presented at these World's Fairs, here we can see an Alaska's exhibit at the 1893 Expo in Chicago. You see that we've got a rustic building. The Chicago building was full of the Beaux-Arts architecture. It really set the tone for that whole period. But we see we've got a rustic building, kind of a native longhouse, and beautiful totem poles. Inside this building, you'd see exhibits of Alaskan commerce and furs and culture and so forth. But here is the Alaskan exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And the photo on the left really shows how that rustic building that they put up for that fair contrasts against the Beaux-Arts look of the fair. But this set of totem poles is really of interest to us on this cruise because these poles were gathered from southeastern Alaska, and they were donated by the owners. Nothing wrong there. But they were shown in St. Louis, and the next year they were used again in at the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, Oregon. But after the Lewis and Clark Exposition, instead of going back to their owners, they were taken up to Sitka, where they were set up in Totem Park in Sitka. And over the years, they had to be worked on and maintained. Many of them are recarved. But if any of us that go to see the totem poles in Sitka on this tour, we'll essentially be seeing these poles from the fairs. So again, we see that in the Buffalo Exposition in 1901, we've got kind of a rustic commercial structure. And over here on the right, we have the totem poles as they were shown at the Lewis and Clark Exposition. And so at this exposition, these men from Seattle said, you know, Alaska has never really been represented in all the ways that it could at one of these World's Fairs. We'd like to do a better job. We think Seattle would be a great place to do it. Now, one of the problems with having all these World's Fairs was that people didn't want to go see exactly the same thing that they had just seen last year. So, one of the real attractions of having another fair was that Alaska, which had been so much in the news and in people's minds for the last decade, they'd have a place to come and really learn about it in a big way. And of course, why not Seattle? Seattle got to host the fair. Then Seattle would be and Washington State, to a lesser extent, the rest of the West would be at the center of the show. So here we have Godfrey Cheelander. He was one of the men behind this. And here we get a look at the lovely logo that was created to represent the fair. If you look on the left, we see a woman from the Orient. She's got a ship. She's representing all this trade from the Pacific Rim. The hope was that people would see it as converging on Seattle, of course. In the middle, we have an Alaskan girl. She's holding a big nugget of gold, and she's representing all these rich resources up in Alaska. And on the right, we see a woman representing the North American continent with a railroad, and all the goods, all the manufactured goods and technology of North America. So this is all converging in Seattle. It's the place to be. And here we have a nice overview looking the other way from our previous overviews. This is drawn, of course, showing the fairgrounds, and I'll see if we can get our laser pointer to point out some things. Once again, here's the big government building. Here's the original Meany Hall, if anyone remembers that is now replaced by a newer one. Here we see various state buildings, a magnificent log building over here, and so forth. But here is 58th Avenue Northeast. Down here is where the hospitals are today. Capitol Hill, the university, the Husky Stadium. All this, whoops, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. All this was mostly woods, had to be created for the fair, and this is this view that we saw looking straight at Mount Rainier. Here's Denny Hall and Barrington Hall and so forth. So, June 1st, 1909, a very special telegraph key was created. And this telegraph key had a big gold nugget put on the telegraph key, and that nugget was a very special one because it was a nugget that was found by George McCormick, the man who really kicked off the gold rush in Alaska with his discoveries. And so this was sent out to the White House, to the Oval Room, and in the Oval Room, President Taft pressed this key, and he opened the AYP from Washington, D.C. But this key was kept around and has been used off and on for very special things, probably across the country, but certainly in Washington State. And so here in 1962, we have President Kennedy using exactly the same telegraph key to kick off the '62 World's Fair. Okay, so finally, here we get to see the Alaska building. And you can see how different it is from those previous World's Fair. It's in the Beaux-Arts style. This is a very large building. It's got a prominent place right next to the government building, and this really is trying to set a different concept in people's minds of Alaska as a modern, civilized place that they should pay attention to, both to perhaps get involved with commercially or culturally. And one thing I'd like to say about these beautiful buildings, though, these buildings were temporary buildings. They look really grand, and of course they were, but they are really made out of plaster and straw on the outside. They had a framework, of course, to hold them up, but they weren't even meant to go through one winter. But nevertheless, they were carved and molded by this really skilled craftsmen. They looked very beautiful up front. They were in kind of a cream-colored ivory. They had these copper green roofs. They were just a lovely thing, but they would be gone by November, these particular buildings. And here we get a view inside the Alaska building. This is the education exhibit. And the way that these exhibits, well, one thing we'd like to point out is you can see how crowded this is. This is a tiny corner of this building. This building was 36,000 square feet. That's about the size of one of our really big super grocery stores. If you think about how many things are crammed into a really big grocery store, then just think about how many things were in this building. And this is just one building. There are the state buildings, the other territorial buildings. They had hundreds of these display cases. The display cases were full of stuff. Where did all this stuff come from? Well, in the case of Alaska, there was this group of 26 high-level persons in Alaska. They got together. They, in turn, appointed a whole set of commissioners in all the various districts of Alaska. The commissioner's job in each of their districts was to enlist the local clubs and the women's auxiliaries and other persons and gather in all this material and bring it down. And this is just a little corner of the education exhibit. You can see how many things are there, but its purpose, it showed both native education and white education. The idea was to show people that Alaska was a civilized place and you could raise your children there and they could grow up and so forth. And here you see the handiworks from the school to show the kinds of work that was done. So here's the fisheries exhibit. It had everything to do with Alaskan fisheries, even a boat there. In 1908, the year before the fair, Alaska had landed approximately 218 million pounds of fish. And of course, this had to lead to some regulations, but people got to really see the scope of fishing in Alaska. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about these World's Fairs that people often don't think of course, they were supposed to showcase all these areas where things come from, but at the very earliest of the modern World's Fairs, the one in London in 1851, the idea was just as much to build up the local populace and their knowledge about modern commerce, technology, and art. And this is one of the reasons why the AYP is so important to the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest may be a little far from the cultural centers of the nation, but here all these things come out, and in this case, Alaska has one of the greatest fishing industries in the country. This is a way for local fishermen in Puget Sound to come in and take a look at the very latest in fishing technology. Here's the furs exhibit. There was, I guess, probably no political problem for furs in those days, but Alaska was the center of a very famous fur industry, of course. It was already partly somewhat in decline, but it can all be examined here. Also, as a part of this exhibit, perhaps you can see there were a lot of mounted animals, a lot of mounted birds to be seen. Once again, people didn't have the chance to really go up and see these things, except maybe a picture in a book, and to see up close. There were over 200 bird specimens that one could examine and see the breadth of wildlife in Alaska. There were many, many large mounted animals that people would never get a chance to see for themselves up close, as we have so many more opportunities to do today. But another interesting thing about this exhibit, they would bring down regular shipments of fresh vegetables from Alaska so that people would get the idea that in Alaska you could grow all sorts of crops, you could grow all kinds of vegetables. You didn't have to just live on canned beans. And here is the mineral exhibit. People needed to get the idea that there were a lot of kinds of minerals to be seen in Alaska, or to be worked with commercially. There's marble, silver, copper, and so forth. Now, one of the things about this World's Fair, and like they still are today, it wasn't good enough to show just one example of something. You tried to get people's attention with a whole pile of it, as you can see over here on the right. Now, one of the highlights of the Alaska building, and actually of the whole fair, was this gold exhibit. It was valued at over $1.25 million in 1909, and that's like $45 million today at today's gold prices. But at today's prices, over $5 billion worth of gold had already been taken out of Alaska in 1909. And so this was a great display that you really wouldn't see at any other World's Fair. And you can see here there's gold bricks. You can probably see there's vials of gold dust. But up here in the middle, you see something really neat. This little business right here, those are the 5 largest gold nuggets ever found in Alaska to date there. And look at how big that top gold nugget is. That is really something. And you can see it down in its special vault down in the basement here. Cross-country walking was a very popular sport in Alaska, not in Alaska, across the country. And people would walk across the country to see the AYP. Here's one of our cross-country walkers But he's standing outside this gold exhibit, and you can see the high security that they had to have for an exhibit of this type at the time. The cage kept you 3 feet away from the gold. The whole exhibit would drop into the basement at the touch of a lever, and down in the basement, the vault had 8 inches of concrete and steel to protect it. Okay, but one of the most interesting parts of this whole giant Alaska display in the Alaska building to us today was the ethnological exhibit and the wonderful artifacts that were displayed there. And the greatest of all those was a collection of over 2,000 artifacts that had been collected by Lieutenant George Emmons of the U.S. Navy. And this entire collection was purchased by the university at the AYP for the Washington State Museum that we now know as the Burke Museum. And they're the core of the ethnological exhibit at the Burke Museum. This is the very start of it. In the Burke Museum, if once you've been in to see the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, which I hope you'll all be inspired to do after seeing this, then the next place to go perhaps is the Burke Museum and see these wonderful ethnological displays from all over the Pacific Rim that are now there. This is a Haida frontlet. This would go up on your forehead either as part of a mask or simply banded separately up there. The Haida are a cultural group that we're probably steaming by their lands right now. They inhabited primarily the Queen Charlotte Islands, which is better known today as Haida Gwaii. But they also were on Prince of Wales Island up in Alaska. And this is just one of these beautiful things. Here quickly, the Klingets are the major cultural group that whose lands we'll visit on our trip. And this would be one of a pair of beautiful rattles used in dances. Here we have a beautiful beaded octopus bag. This type of beading really comes out of the center of the continent, but as trade increased between Alaska and the interior, Alaskans got interested in this, and they created this wonderful thing. You can see the legs of the octopus there. This is a canoe ornament in the Chilkat colors. We'll hopefully, if we visit some museums, we'll see the famous blankets done in these colors, but this would go on a canoe. Here is one of my favorite pieces. This is a face stamp from Sitka, and you would literally use this to prepare yourself for a dance. You could stamp your face with this item, and I really like this sharpener. And if you look at this sharpener, you can kind of guess that it wasn't really created so much as desiccated, but this would be used to sharpen sticks and wood and bone and other such things. But another great exhibitor in the Alaska building was a man from West Seattle. He started the Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, which is still on the waterfront, J.E. Stanley. And Stanley had thousands of articles of his own that had been gathered over the years for sale at the AYP. Here's an example of a whale oil lamp, and this was purchased at the AYP by someone from the Midwest. It went back to the Midwest. And Stanley also employed many native carvers to make very authentic models and authentic items. This particular item is a model of the Seattle Pioneer Square totem pole that was carved. It was sold at the AYP, we think, for $15. Now, in 1909, $15 was a lot of money. This little totem pole, it's actually about 2 feet high, was purchased at the AYP by a young doctor and his new bride who were honeymooning on their trip from Connecticut. So this was taken back to Connecticut in 1909. It was sort of uncovered recently by one of his heirs, and after a couple of years of negotiations, it returned back to Seattle just this spring. And here's another quick view of just some of Stanley's things in the Alaska building. as the fair was being prepared. You see all kinds of totem poles. This sort of thing could be seen all over the fairgrounds. And I like this picture, probably taken in the Alaska building. This was taken at the AYP by the fair's official photographer. These girls are in front of what's called a chilkat blanket. Hopefully we'll get to see one or more, perhaps in Sitka or Ketchikan. I like to think that the girl on our right there is the photographer's daughter. I don't really know. It's hard to research this. I'm not sure about the girl next to her. She might have been a native girl from Alaska, but the fair liked to promote this idea of togetherness at the fair. Wonderful image. Here we see the grandest totem poles of all at the fair. This is the south gate of the fair down by the Montlake Bridge today. And these were actually made out of plaster, but they represent an attempt by the fair to create kind of a new idea to try on people. This is a blend of Japanese and Chinese and Northwest Coast design, all kind of worked together. And down here with his dogs, we can see a performer named Caribou Bill. Caribou Bill drove this sled with wheels at times, of course, all the way from Valdez. He was a kind of a gambler and a racer. He would do things for bets. He laid a bet up in Alaska that he could drive his team down to the AYP by June 1st, and by golly, he made it. And then showed his dogs at the fair. And so we're going to take now a little closer look at these totems and enjoy them a little bit here. There's Caribou Bill and a close-up of him. Okay, now there was also every kind of literature handed out to promote Alaska, and actually every other person that came to the AYP, states and countries and manufacturers and so forth. Here's just an example of the effort that went in. If you opened up these books, you'd see all sorts of photographs, everything from hunting and fishing and mining to nice houses that people had, and a glimpse into the rough side of life in Alaska. Here's another couple of typical kinds of books that you would see, something to sort of, something for everybody to help them learn about Alaska. But there are also millions of these postcards, as we saw before, and these postcards helped promote the whole West Coast, California and Washington and Oregon, but also Alaska. Of this one manufacturer alone, the order was for 20 million postcards, and this was just one manufacturer. And because of that, one can find these postcards today at very reasonable cost. But I particularly like this series of Alaskan natives. I thought I'd show you a few. We've got a couple of more northern Alaskans here, a young woman and a young man in his sealskin parka. And here we have an older woman. She's probably sitting in front of her own family's carvings here in this photograph. And John Spoon, we don't know the story of, but he apparently was a bank robber or something, a native bank robber, and a Wild West sort of a character. How they were able to get him to sit still in front of the camera before he ran off to escape from law, I don't know. But it was also important to show native assimilation. There was a Native American Congress that included tribes from all over the country. This is an image on one of these cards showing some Alaskan women who'd been sent to Carlisle University in Pennsylvania. Now there's a lot of controversy around these Native American educational schools, but nevertheless, at least Carlisle University was a very progressive school. It was a model for many other institutions. So many fraternities and other sorts of organizations had a venue, had their national meetings, sometimes week-long meetings at the AYP. The Arctic Brotherhood was just one of these groups, but this is one of the earliest organizations to support the AYP, and they brought out part of this idea of how grand Alaska's display would be. Seattle also had a big music publishing industry at this time. And so the Arctic Brotherhood even had their own song, they had their own building on the fairgrounds. And of course, when President Taft came to visit the AYP, he was immediately made an honorary member of this organization. But not to be outdone, the Elks were also here in force. And here's a little something maybe for any Bills in the audience. I don't know if Wild Bill is with us, but Bill, this is for you. At any rate, here again, we see a number of very interesting things. We see the commerce coming in from the Pacific. We see the railroad goods, the technology coming in from the continent. We see Alaska. We see, once again, this beautiful vista of the fairgrounds itself, looking out at Mount Rainier. The Elks would put on their own carnival within the AYP. And this carnival was important. It lasted about a week. 2 years after the AYP, the Elks were instrumental in the creation of a big week-long celebration in Seattle called the Golden Potlatch. And historians today look at this Golden Potlatch as the real beginning of the seafair tradition. And so we can look to the AYP as having had a bit of a role in the launch of Seafair, and that Seafair is part of the AYP legacy that we still have today. The Pay Streak, the entertainment zone, was a wonderful thing, and here you can see how crowded and popular it was. This is just a little glimpse of it. This is kind of down where the University Hospital is now, and it was very well liked. And here we see one of our sourdoughs who's gotten himself all freshened up at the Butler Hotel, and he's down enjoying an exotic dancer from Egypt on the Pay Streak. But one of the interesting aspects of the Pay Streak were these living tableaux of Native people. They're a little controversial today, although I'd submit to you that any of these fair visitors would be fairly horrified if they saw our reality TV today. But nevertheless, these people would perform all day long, day in and out, showing their style of life. These particular individuals were actually from Labrador, but they were representing Northern life, and these were World's Fair veterans. To give you some idea, this woman who's on the left was actually married to the Caucasian owner of this whole show, and the younger members of the troupe would get educated in American schools in the off-season. They were all very cultured, and this one woman peeking out of the igloo is really special to us. She was born at the 1893 exposition, the Chicago World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition, and she was named Miss Columbia. And here is a young baby that was born about the time of the AYP, and he was part of this troupe. He was named Seattle. So here's baby Seattle. But if we look at this picture, we can see that Miss Columbia was hosted by society ladies wherever she went. She was very popular, and there was a competition. She was voted the queen of the Pay Streak, and incidentally, the Pay Streak really is a mining term that refers to that area in the rock that you're mining where the good stuff really is, and that makes the whole mine pay off. So she was the queen of the Pay Streak. Here she is with her crown. She's being fated through the grounds. But if we look at another woman of approximately the same age, Miss Columbia is about 16 years old here. Here's another beautiful young lady, and she is actually the daughter of the man who took the picture that we just saw. She's the daughter of one of the official photographers on the fairgrounds. Now, what would these two young women have in common? Well, among other things, besides their age, they were both destined for Hollywood. And in 1909, Hollywood was really just becoming a force in American entertainment. We don't really know whether Elizabeth Park here had all that much success, although we have a few of her letters from down there survive. But Miss Columbia went on to star in films. And most of those have not survived. Films from that era, many are lost. But we know that she was a star. There were many other Alaskan-type things to see on the pastry. Here's the Alaska Theater of Sensations. If you look closely at this image, what I like is that these girls have gowns put over their costumes. But nevertheless, they're making sure you get to see the ankles. That was a big deal in 1909. This guitar is also sort of interesting. It's kind of a long story, but this was a type of guitar invented in Seattle that would go on to become a feature in big bands and the invention of the Hawaiian guitar. Here is this giant roller coaster that sort of featured Alaskan scenery. It was called the Scenic Railway. This represented world-class entertainment. This was as big a roller coaster or larger than any that existed in the world at this time. The man that built this was famous for inventing this sort of thing. So everyone got to take something home from the AYP. There was something for every budget, and a lot of things were given away at the AYP. This is a gorgeous bronze vase that was presented to President Taft by the Japanese Washington State Commission, a very valuable sort of thing. This is now in the hands of an unknown European collector. But it features this inlaid bronze. This was the sort of work that you would see on sword hilts and so forth. Here's a couple of Tiffany vases that were made for the AYP and sold at the AYP. Beautiful vases that are still very valuable today. Here is a beautiful example of arts and crafts. Pottery. This was sculpted by one of the great sculptors that helped design all that building detail. This is a beautiful piece of plein air painting that was shown at the fair. An example of something from the California building, or at least by one of the painters who we know exhibited at the building. Some of the beautiful things that you could buy for yourself, and many of these things decorate Seattle homes, but not just Seattle homes all over the country actually today. But if your budget wasn't quite up to that sort of thing, there were wonderful things that you could take as souvenirs. Here's a sterling spoon with a totem handle, and the bowl shows the Alaska building. This is an abalone shell that was fastened into an inkwell. Just one of the fair was full of just thousands and thousands and thousands of these souvenir items that were sold, and you can still get them today. Here's a watch fob. There was a lot of enamel jewelry that was much more affordable. This also shows this theme of international cooperation that was so much a part of these fairs in this period. And here are some Alaska-style souvenirs that you could get if you wanted to. You can see a gold pan and gold nugget and gold mining things and bears and so forth. Everyone could take something home. But if you really wanted to, you could actually take home real Alaskan gold. This is a 14-karat gold coin, and you could buy these things. They weren't very big, so they're affordable. This one is about a gram, but nevertheless, you can see the miner and so forth. All right. Well, here just before the dawn of the Seattle 1962 World's Fair, you can see some young boys examining their grandparents' souvenirs at the Museum of History and Industry. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your little tour of the AYP. All good things have to come to an end. I'm always a little sad when I have to stop looking and taking my own little tour of the fair. And certainly it was a very nostalgic moment when this fair closed on October 16th, 1909. They went until midnight that night. All the favorite musical groups sang their numbers for a last time. Everyone sang Old Lang Syne. Everyone on the fairgrounds sang it all together. And then the beautiful illumination on these buildings. At midnight, the fair was blacked out, and everyone just stood in silence to remember their lovely memory of this fair, and then they just turned the walkway lights back on, and everyone got to leave quietly. So that concludes our little glimpse into Alaska at the AYP. Thank you so much for being a great audience. really appreciate you coming, and if we have time for any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but you can find me if you like. If anyone wants a little souvenir of the fair of their own, I do have some business cards with me here. I'd be happy to give you one. If I can fish it out of my pocket, I'd be happy. Anyone that would like a reminder of the website. Actually, not all of this material is yet on the website. There's a whole bunch of other material to see. I hope to get this all worked in eventually. But just come and see me if you'd like one of these, and then when you're home, you can read up more about the fair. Are there any questions that anyone...
Before we take questions, would you please give a big hand for Dan Kerlee here?
Thank you so very much.
I just want to explain to you that what you've seen is an example of somebody wearing his heart on his sleeve, and somebody who is here out of the goodness of his heart to educate and inspire us all. And that is what our Southwest Seattle Historical Society is all about. I mentioned Liz Day earlier. She's a stellar volunteer for us. I want to thank her once again, and Jim Charon Johnston also of AAA. This is the kind of thing that we do all the time. Our mission is education, preservation, and advocacy. And like Dan, who has business cards for you if you would like, I have our latest hot off the press newsletter about all the things that we are doing as an organization, and including our Champagne Gala lunch coming up. It's a brunch on Saturday, November 7th. How many of you know the Alki Homestead restaurant in Alki Beach in West Seattle? Well, we're celebrating the restoration of that, and it's on Saturday at 11 o'clock, November 7th at Salty's on Alki. I have information on that if you're at all interested, and many other things that we're doing. So, are there any questions for Dan? Yes? I'll repeat the question.
I have a statement. I live on the East Coast now, but...
Let me come down with the mic.
I live on the East Coast now, but in 1962, I have a photo of myself and about 25 of my fraternity brothers taken in 1962 at those arches at the Space Needle, because our fraternity, which also had a lot of oarsmen in it, we were known for our singing ability, which we honed by going around with the various sororities and serenading on rainy nights. But we entered a contest in, I think, 10 out of the 29 fraternities at that time. And we won. So we sang at the World's Fair in '62. I think it was probably in the fall. The other thing was I think that the only two profitable World Fairs were Seattle and, surprisingly, my hometown of Spokane. World's Fair in '74 were the only ones that made any money. And the last thing is, since I now live in the other Washington, the picture at Carlisle is, of course, the Carlisle Barracks, known as the Army War College. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Dan, do you have a comment about music at the AYP? You touched on it briefly. You want to amplify just a hair?
Well, at the AYP, the really big World's Fairs would have a symphony orchestra, and actually the AYP did have an orchestra in residence. It was the Young Seattle Symphony, but the AYP was full of music and performance, and the AYP had many symphonic bands. If you're familiar with the Sousa Band of this period, the Sousa Band didn't come to the AYP, they had too busy of a schedule. But other bands of that same symphonic character came, and of course, there were a few bands that came down from Alaska. In fact, one of them from the Metlakatla School featured native performers so that people could see how well that they did.
Do I have other questions for Dan about the AYP, about how Alaska was showcased? Questions from any of you? please, another warm applause for Dan Kerlee today. And Dan is around. You know, one of the nice things about the cruise is nobody leaves early. So Dan will be around the next 6 days. I'll be around the next 6 days. Come see me if you'd like a newsletter right now. Happy to talk with you at any time. Thanks for being on the Alaska Totem Cruise.